Architecture isn't just an art or a technical discipline, it's also an ideological tool. Manfredo Tafori argues that Bourgeois culture uses architecture as a mechanism of reconciliation, making conflicts invisible and sustaining the capitalist order. In this sense, architecture serves as an aesthetic veil. In the 18th century, thinkers like Marc Anthony Lager aimed to shape cities in harmony with nature. However, according to Taffer, this was not a true understanding of nature, but rather an ideological reconstruction of its picturesque aesthetics influenced urban planning, leading cities to be designed like paintings. Although modern art movements initially opposed capitalism, they eventually became integrated into the system. Cubism treated traditional narratives and refined art, yet Braccio and Picasso's assemblage techniques was later adopted for industrial production. The movement rejected the system by making art chaotic and meaningless, but ironically, even this became part of a planning strategy. Le Corbusier approached the city as a mission project like Plan Voisin aimed to create effective urban environments. However, Taffer argues that such projects didn't lead to social revolution, but rather spatially organized capitalist production. Taffer demonstrated how modern architecture gradually became a tool of the capitalist system. He asserted that architecture shouldn't be viewed solely as an aesthetic or technical field, but must be analyzed within its economic and political context, while modernist movements initially appeared to challenge the system. They ultimately became instruments for structuring capitalism's spatial order.
I will explain Ludwig Hilmerseimer's understanding of the modern city. Hilmerseimer explains the architecture of large cities with two basic factors: the individual buildings, cells, and the urban organisms formed by their combinations. According to him, the smallest unit, the room, shapes the houses shapes the blocks, and the blocks shapes the entire city. Modern cities should be through the large social machine formed by the combination of all the components rather than individual buildings. With this perspective, Hilmerseimer redefined the role of the architect. Instead of being an artist or designer in the traditional sense, the architect should now be a manager of the city organization. The architectural object, this is the individual buildings, loses its importance. The main issue is to establish a system that regulates the functioning of the city. Therefore, in Hilmerseimer's understanding of architecture, buildings should be reduced to cubic and geometric forms, because a homogeneous city can only be built through standard, repeatable, and rational forms. These ideas spread rapidly through Europe in the 1920s and shaped modern city planning in the cities such as Frankfurt, Berlin, and Amsterdam. For example, in the projects implemented by Ernst May in Frankfurt, urban planning was treated like industrial production, and housing was standardized like parts on a production line. Martin Wagner's studies in Berlin and Cornelis van Oosten's plans for Amsterdam similarly aimed to establish the foundation of a modern urban order. However, these projects could not fully integrate with the traditional city structures and therefore could not completely resolve urban contradictions. Hilmerseimer's rationalist approach was criticized by other architects of the period. For example, Expressionist architect and the Neue Sachlichkeit movement argued that the cities were not just functional space, but should also meet people's emotional and social needs. Fritz Werger's Schiele House or Erich Mendelssohn's dynamic forms, in contrast to Hilmerseimer's strictly geometric approach, criticize the individual experience. However, according to Hilmerseimer, individual aesthetic concerns should be set aside and the entire city should be built within the framework of the certain rules. At this point, all through Le Corbusier's approach were similar to Hilbersheimer's. There were fundamental differences between them. Le Corbusier also considered the city as an organism, but his proposals were more flexible and dynamic. The Opus Plan, which he developed especially for Algeria, aimed to transform the existing structures by adding a layer to it, rather than completely destroying the traditional city texture. However, these radical plans of Le Corbusier could not be put into practice due to economic and political constrictions of the period. By the mid-20th century, modern architecture and urbanism were completely intertwined with the capitalist production systems. Under the influence of Keynesian economic policies, urban planning was no longer just about design, but had largely become a tool of economic rationalization. In this process, the architect was no longer a figure who simply designed buildings, but rather an organizer who managed the production and consumption mechanisms of cities. However, this led to criticism in the ideology of architecture. The city had now become a structure that was standardized like an industrial production and left like a little room for individual creativity. As a result, Hilbersheimer's approach proposed to set aside individual aesthetic concerns and organize cities as a function machines. However, this perspective has been criticized for ignoring the spatial experience of individuals. Modern urbanism continues to develop by trying to establish a balance between these two views.
This text explores the ideological foundations, historical developments, and relationship of modern architecture and urban planning with utopian thought. It examines how intellectual movements such as Enlightenment, Romanticism, Positivism, and Marxism, which emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, included the architectural utopias of the 20th century.
1. The noble Soch and Utopia. The figure of the noble Soch is linked to the idea of natural purity and the reconstruction of society. The Enlightenment addressed human nature from both rational and romantic perspectives. Enlightenment and Utopianism. Utopia, initially a theoretical concept, gradually became a tool for social transformation. Saint Simon and his followers advocate for making science the foundation and politics. 3. Romanticism and organic society. In the 19th century, the idea of an organic society emerged as a reaction against the mechanical model of society. Edmund Burke criticized the French Revolution and argued for the preservation of tradition. 4. Positivism and Marx critique. Utopian socialism was gradually replaced by a more rigid positivism. Marx rejected utopian projects as insufficient and instead proposed scientific socialism. 5. Modern architecture, futurism, and authoritarianism. Modern architecture is closely linked to scientific progress and social transformation. Futurist architecture poses both revolutionary and authoritarian potential. Figures like Le Corbusier and Gropius saw architecture as a project for social liberty.
The text examines the influence of historical ideologies of modern architecture, emphasizing how utopian urban designs are couched between idealism and mechanical progress, futurist and modernist architecture. Shaped by both ideology and science, hold the potential to be both libertarian and oppressive.
According to Rowe and Kocher, modernist utopias failed because they couldn't understand the chaotic and multi-layered structure of cities. They argued that the solution is more flexible and fragmented urban approaches that can adapt to local dynamics. On the other hand, Tafuri has a more extreme view. He believes modernist utopias were tools of capitalist ideology. Utopias hit capitalism's search for perfect order with architectural beauty and helped keep the system going. The collapse of utopias was the inevitable result of capitalism using architecture as a practical tool. Rowe and Kotter see utopias as projects that need fixing, while Tafuri sees them as a tool of capitalism from the beginning. Rowe and Cotter believe that architecture didn't lose its meaning after utopias failed. In the holistic approach, a city doesn't need to come from a big plan. It can be an imperfect but living whole where small changing and evolving parts exist together. The fall of utopias isn't a reason for architecture to fall into despair. Architecture can still help social life. Tafuri has a more negative view. He thinks modern architecture is so connected to capitalism that it can't escape its influence. According to Tafuri, even the holisticity idea doesn't solve this problem. This might seem more free, but it could still help capitalism survive and grow. In short, Rowe and Cotter believe architecture can stay meaningful after utopias fall, while Tafuri sees architecture as a quiet tool of capitalism.
In Holisticity, Colin Rowe and Fred Cotter critique modernism's reading and totalizing approach to urban planning, arguing that its obsession with order lends to homogeneous space that errs historical layers and ignore urban complexity. They propose a holisticity where different architectural periods and spatial concepts consist, creating a more dynamic and layered urban environment. Manfredo Tafuri, however, interprets modernism's order as an extension of capitalist rationalization. He argues that modern architecture, rather than begin a utopian escape, ultimately serves economic power by reinforcing capitalist structures. The modernist pursuit of purity and autonomy in design, Tafari suggests, is a disquisite mechanism of control integrating tools into the broader economic system. While Rowe and Cotter critique modernism's aesthetic and experimental shortcomings, Tafuri exposes its ideologistic alignment with capitalism. In today's cities, Rowe and Cotter's college city model can offer a flexible and inclusive approach, especially for rapidly growing metropolises. Instead of unformed solution, urban planning should integrate historical layers and diverse spatial elements to maintain continuity and identity. This approach supports sustainable design and urban regeneration, creating more resilient and livable spaces. On the other hand, Rafaris warns about architecture's limits, highlight the increasing corporate influence over cities where architecture often serves economic interests rather than public needs. As cities become dominated by iconic landmarks and commercial hubs, architecture risks losing its social function. Ultimately, Rowe and Cotter emphasize the importance of preserving historical and spatial diversity, while Tafuri exists architecture becoming a tool of economic power. A balanced urban model should integrate these perspectives, maintaining both historical depth and social equity.